We chose bioenergy as our topic.
Bioenergy is a renewable energy source produced by living biological organisms. Energy is fueled using biomass, and biomass is the total mass of organisms in a given area that may be used for electrical or fuel power. Bioenergy is the energy extracted from the biomass. Biomass is the fuel, and bioenergy is contained in the fuel.
Biomass is plant material and animal waste, and it's the oldest source of renewable energy. It's based off the carbon cycle, and it contains any organic material which has stored sunlight in the form of chemical energy. It's derived from recently living organisms, animal waste, or agricultural products.
The environmental impact of bioenergy is that production of biomass requires 86% of the freshwater use. Also, deforestation takes place, which is cutting down trees for use of biomass and land use.
Biomass is the total mass of organisms in a given area. It may be used for fuel or electrical power, and it's found in biological waste, which involves wood, straw, manure, sugarcane, soybeans, switchgrass, animal fats, corn, and vegetable oil. The bioenergy potential in a region is limited by various factors, such as the demand for food, industrial roundwood, traditional wood fuel, and the need to maintain existing forests for the production of biodiversity. Also has waste opportunity fuels, such as landfill gas, forest residue, urban wood waste, water waste, sludge, and animal manure. And then this is just a graph of the sources of bioenergy.
And the ecological impact of bioenergy is that it changes land use, habitat loss and fragmentation take place, and the water and air quality decrease.
So there's two main different types of bioenergy, or basically their functions. It can be used for electricity, which is also referred to as biopower, or liquid fuels, which are referred to as biofuels. And for the electricity, it's basically captured steam or heat, which can be used to power turbines, and that can produce electricity. And then for the liquid fuels, the two most common types are ethanol and biodiesel. And the ethanol is produced by fermentation, and the biodiesel is produced by transesterification. And basically, the process of how bioenergy comes to be is it begins with the collection of the biomass, which is the source, the main source. Then you have to pre-process the material to make it more dense and less bulky, easier to work with. And then the conversion to release energy, there's four main ways to convert it, which we will get to. And then you have your consumption of bioenergy. And for biopower, there's 6 main types of power systems. So it's direct firing, co-firing, gasification, anaerobic digestion, and pyrolysis. And in the direct fire, basically you just burn bioenergy feedstocks, which is the biomass after it's been pre-processed. It's called feedstocks. You burn them directly to produce steam. Steam is captured by a turbine, and then the generator converts it into electricity. Also, methane can be used as an energy source for electricity. It's burned in a boiler. The steam is then converted into electricity generation. And the two new ways of electricity generation can be microturbines and fuel cells. So microturbines have outputs of anywhere between 25 to 500 kilowatts, and methane is involved in that microturbine. Also, methane can be used as a fuel in a fuel cell, and it works a lot like batteries, but they don't need to be recharged. And they produce electricity as long as there's fuel in the cell.
So this is a chart of the overall process of taking biomass and converting it to electricity. So it begins with energy from sunlight, which is then transformed into energy through photosynthesis that's conserved in plants, which starts over here. And then plants can be either used directly to convert into electricity, or it can be turned through consumption into energy for animals or humans. And furthermore, animals can be consumed by humans, which then gives them the energy that has been transferred. We then take the waste from each of these things, from animals, consumers, or from plants, and we use a series of decomposition and combustion reactions to create electricity in a power plant, which then can be used and given out to humans to use as electricity.
Okay, and then also for biofuel, biofuels can be used as transportation. So the two main types, as I said, is ethanol and biodiesel. The ethanol is made by fermentation, and for the fermentation, it's any biomass that's high in carbohydrates, such as starches, sugars, and celluloses, and that's how it's converted into the energy. The ethanol is used as a fuel additive to cut down a vehicle's carbon monoxide emissions. And biodiesel is combining alcohol with vegetable oil, animal fat, or recycled cooking grease. And actually, soybean oil is the most dominant material in biodiesel production, and it's basically a renewable alternative fuel for diesel engines. And then lastly, for the kind of process right here with the pre-processing, it's basically the biomass sometimes is really bulky and sometimes must be made into a more suitable form. And it may require chipping, grinding, or aggregating, or densification to reduce the volume of the actual biomass.
And then this is just a diagram of,
We had a diagram of electricity, so this is the diagram of the
biofuels and how they can be used and how they're made and how they can be used in the,
forms of transportation.
okay.
So there's four main ways to convert the biomass or feedstock into actual energy. So each one is appropriate for a specific type of biomass, and they also result in specific energy products. So thermal conversion is the first, and
That mainly consists of, it uses heat and possibly oxygen, and the different processes in that can include combustion, pyrolysis, and torrefaction, and they mainly produce power, heat, and steam.
so the combustion is basically the burning of the biomass with oxygen gas. Furnaces and boilers are used to produce steam, and that steam produces electricity. The pyrolysis and torrefaction are basically, they don't produce energy directly, but they make the biomass more energy dense and easier to combust to make that electricity.
Thermochemical conversion is the application of heat in chemical processes and produces gaseous fuels.
It kind of takes place in 3 stages. So the first stage is solid biomass is converted into a gas. Second stage is that gas is then condensed to oil form. And then the third stage would be the oil is conditioned or synthesized into a syngas. And the syngas is basically a hydrocarbon gas which can be used to produce the biodiesel.
Next one is
Biochemical conversion. So
this uses enzymes or bacteria to break down biomass. The two kind of processes here are anaerobic digestion and fermentation.
and that creates liquid fuels. So the anaerobic digestion uses microorganisms and oxygen in free environments to break down the material, and it can produce methane and carbon-rich biogas from the biomass. And bacteria is basically used in hydrolysis to break down the carbohydrates, and then those carbohydrates that are broken down and sugars are converted into CO2 and methane, which are the energy.
Include combustion, pyrolysis, and torrefaction, and they mainly produce power, heat, and steam.
So the combustion is basically the burning of the biomass with oxygen gas. Furnaces and boilers are used to produce steam, and that steam produces electricity. The pyrolysis and torrefaction are basically, they don't produce energy directly, but they make the biomass more energy dense and easier to combust to make that electricity.
Thermochemical conversion is the application of heat in chemical processes and produces gaseous fuels. It kind of takes place in 3 stages. So the first stage is solid biomass is converted into a gas. Second stage is that gas is then condensed to oil form. And then the third stage would be the oil is conditioned or synthesized into a syngas. And the syngas is basically a hydrocarbon gas which can be used to produce the biodiesel. Next one is
Biochemical conversion.
So this uses enzymes or bacteria to break down biomass. The two kind of processes here are anaerobic digestion and fermentation.
And that creates liquid fuels. So the anaerobic digestion uses microorganisms and oxygen in free environments to break down the material.
and it can produce methane and carbon-rich biogas from the biomass. And bacteria is basically used in hydrolysis to break down the carbohydrates, and then those carbohydrates that are broken down and sugars are converted into CO2 and methane, which are the energy, bioenergy fuels. And fermentation is basically just using yeast to convert carbohydrates into alcohol, which is how we get the production of ethanol, which is the other biofuel. And then the last form of conversion is chemical conversion, and this uses chemical agents and produces liquid fuels again. So transesterification is the most common form, and it's a chemical reaction through which fatty acids from oils or fats are bonded to alcohol, and this reduces the viscosity of the fatty acids and makes them more combustible and able to produce the biodiesel. And this is basically a depiction of everything I just went over, with all the different processes for each conversion and all their products.
So this is a chemical equation that shows the conversion between feedstock and how it is converted through syngas into hydrocarbons and water. And hydrocarbons are basically a form of fuel, which is often in liquids through methanol or ethanol. So this intermediate step is something called synthetic gas, which contains a mix of hydrogen gas and carbon monoxide, and then produces a hydrocarbon through that. So this will produce different types of fuels and water, as well as some kind of heat through gasification. So the efficiency of biofuel is a win-win in all situations. So first of all, it cuts down on energy pollution and because there's no carbon emission. And it takes what would otherwise be in a landfill or considered waste and converts that into something that is actually usable. Another important part of this is that it is not susceptible to blackouts, and it's a very constant form of energy. So it's used a lot on the East Coast in hospitals because during large storms, hospitals still need to be in use, and so bioenergy can muscle through those storms and continue to give energy. It is also a replenishable source of energy since it does come from the sun through photosynthesis. After giving our bodies nourishment, then we can use the waste from that to convert energy, which can also be used. It also cuts down on petroleum, and the U.S. Department of Agriculture and the Department of Energy have predicted that in 2030 we could cut down 30% of our petroleum use, and this could mean really good things economically, being less dependent on foreign oil, but also in the environment by having less risk for wildlife to be susceptible to oil spills, and also less CO2 emission that comes from producing and harvesting fossil fuels.
So for the psychology part of bioenergy, the technology of bioenergy won't help the world unless we look at the physical aspects of bioenergy. So the definition of social psychology is how we think about, influence, and relate to one another. And to get into more detail, we have a couple more definitions. Normative and informational social influence. Normative informational social influence is the need to belong to groups or conform to rules of other people. And informational social influence is when we don't know something, we tend to copy other people. And descriptive and injunctive norms. Descriptive social norms is perception of the behavior of people around you, and injunctive norms is whether a behavior will be approved or disapproved.
Okay. So, obviously, bioenergy is preferred over fossil fuels because of the benefits it has for the earth and in general the environment. So, that being said, an example of a normative influence on people and their use of bioenergy. The more people that use bioenergy, the more inclined others are to do the same. Basically, people follow the majority of what everyone else is doing. People are influenced by large masses of numbers and followings. Informational influence. Informational influence is basically Because some people are unaware of the dangers of fossil fuels, they use that as an alternative to bioenergy, just because they're not aware of the harm it does to our environment. With that being said, people who are uneducated on all the facts can easily be influenced to use that as opposed to bioenergy. With injunctive and descriptive norms. So for an example of an injunctive norm using bioenergy, one resident is doing the right thing. They have solar panels, they recycle, they conserve as much energy as possible, and they basically are doing what you're supposed to do, or what you should do, at least for the environment, to help it. Then descriptive, one resident keeps all their lights on, does basically the exact opposite, keeps lights on throughout the day, uses his car, which is emitting bad fumes into the environment, and doesn't own a recycle bin, and basically he does what he feels is right.